My name is Joanna, and at 32 years old, I never imagined my family would intentionally leave me here to freeze. I had been waiting in this frozen wasteland for exactly 3 hours, while my fingers slowly lost all feeling inside my leather gloves. My anxiety spiked as I frantically dialed my father and my sister repeatedly, because I was terrified they had crashed their car in the blinding snowstorm. The overwhelming silence of the mountain was the only answer I received, until my phone finally vibrated in my numb hand. I unlocked the screen expecting a desperate plea for help, or an update on their safety, but instead I saw a message from my father that instantly froze my blood. The text displayed a single cold sentence that simply read, "Sorry, I sent the wrong address." There was no explanation, no new location provided, and absolutely no concern for my safety, as the temperature dropped significantly below zero. It became painfully clear that I was stranded in a desolate wilderness, while my family was undoubtedly enjoying a warm meal somewhere else without me. I stared at the dark cabin that represented their betrayal and wiped the frozen tears from my cheeks. I decided right then that I would not call them back to beg for directions or forgiveness. I stepped into my car with a ruthless plan to make them pay for every single second of this humiliation. If you want to see how I canceled her credit card, stopped his heart medication, and changed all the locks on the house they live in, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Driving back down the icy mountain pass, memories of the last 10 years played in my mind, like a tragic movie that I could not switch off no matter how hard I tried. The silence in the car amplified the bitterness I felt about how my mother Linda had walked out of our lives a decade ago, because she simply could not survive the suffocation of the toxic environment anymore. She left me alone to shoulder the crushing financial responsibility for the entire family, which included a manipulative father and an entitled sister who both refused to lift a finger to work. My father, Arthur, was a master at weaponizing his own biology against me whenever he needed cash for his gambling habits or expensive tastes. He frequently claimed that his high blood pressure or his fragile heart condition would deteriorate instantly if he did not get exactly what he wanted from me. I spent years paying for premium healthcare plans and imported medications because the guilt of potentially causing his death was too heavy for me to bear. Then there was my older sister Gretchen, who genuinely believed that working for a living was beneath her dignity, as long as I was around to pay the bills. She treated my bank account like her personal trust fund and constantly demanded supplementary credit cards to purchase designer handbags that cost more than most people earn in a month. Whenever I tried to set boundaries regarding her spending, Arthur would clutch his chest and gasp for air until I surrendered another credit card to keep the peace in the house. I had become nothing more than a walking ATM machine that they withdrew from without ever depositing a single ounce of gratitude or affection. The situation escalated when Arthur approached his 65th birthday with a list of demands that totaled over $25,000 because he wanted to impress our extended relatives. I agreed to pay for everything because I foolishly hoped that providing this dream celebration would finally earn me their respect and validate my place in the family. Gretchen called me a week before the event to announce that she had booked the most exclusive venue, which happened to be a 3-hour drive from where we lived. I spent the entire morning preparing myself to be the perfect daughter and drove all the way to the location with a trunk full of expensive gifts. I arrived at the luxury restaurant feeling exhausted but ready to celebrate, only to find the lobby strangely quiet given the magnitude of the party I had funded. I approached the front desk with a smile that quickly faded when the receptionist looked at me with confusion after I gave her the details. She checked the computer system multiple times before informing me that no reservation existed under the name Arthur or Gretchen for that evening. A wave of humiliation washed over me as I realized I was standing in a high-end restaurant in my evening gown for a party that did not exist anywhere but in my imagination. I immediately pulled out my phone to call my father, but it rang endlessly until it went to voicemail without any answer. I tried calling Gretchen next, but she also ignored my calls, even though I knew she always had her phone glued to her hand. It became painfully obvious that they had intentionally sent me on a wild goose chase to a fake location so they could celebrate without me. The realization that I was the one paying for the champagne they were drinking somewhere else made my stomach turn with nausea. My intuition screamed that something deceitful was happening at the house I legally owned, but allowed them to occupy rent-free all these years. I walked back to my car with shaking hands and decided to drive straight to my father's house to confront the reality I had been ignoring for too long. After 2 hours of driving through the storm, my car tires finally crunched onto the gravel driveway. I deliberately stopped the vehicle a considerable distance away from the main gate to ensure that the headlights would not alert anyone inside the house to my presence. The sprawling 2-story Victorian mansion stood majestically against the dark winter sky, radiating a warmth and vibrancy that stood in stark contrast to the freezing darkness I had just endured. This was the property that I had purchased 5 years ago, with the intention of providing a comfortable retirement home for Arthur. Yet tonight, it felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a fortress that had been barred against me. I stepped out of the car into the biting wind and pulled my scarf tighter around my face as I navigated through the shadows of the large oak trees lining the perimeter of the lawn. The sound of heavy bass and laughter drifted through the cold air, confirming that the celebration was in full swing, despite the lies I had been told. I quietly approached the side of the house where the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main living room offered an unobstructed view of the festivities inside. My breath caught in my throat when I saw Arthur standing in the center of the room, holding a glass of expensive scotch in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other. He looked nothing like the frail, sickly man who had claimed just last week that his heart condition was so severe he could barely walk up the stairs without assistance. He was laughing uproariously at a joke, and even performed a little dance move that required a level of agility he supposedly lost years ago. Standing right next to him was Gretchen, looking absolutely radiant in a sequined dress that I knew I had paid for during our last shopping trip. She was parading around the room with a brand-new designer handbag draped over her arm, showing it off to our aunts and cousins who were looking at her with admiration. It was sickening to watch them enjoying the finest food and drink on my dime, while I had been sent to a frozen wasteland to freeze. I needed to confirm the depth of their deception one last time before I made my move, so I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my brother-in-law, Derek. I watched through the window as Derek pulled his phone from his pocket, looked at the caller ID, and rolled his eyes before excusing himself to a quieter corner of the room near the curtains. He answered the call with a tone of voice that was so deceptively warm and concerned that it almost made me question my own sanity. "We are at the restaurant, Joanna. Where are you? It is such a shame you could not make it." His voice oozed with fake sympathy, and I could hear the muffled sounds of the party continuing in the background despite his attempt to hide it. I gripped the phone tighter and forced my voice to remain steady as I asked him if everyone was enjoying the food I had paid for. I watched him glance nervously over his shoulder at Gretchen before he continued his charade. He told me that the food was delicious, but they were all terribly worried about me driving in the snow and that they hoped I would turn around and go home for my own safety. The audacity of his lies was breathtaking, especially as I stood mere meters away from him on the other side of the glass. I pressed him again, asking specifically if Arthur was feeling well enough to be out at a restaurant given his condition. Derek laughed nervously and started to pretend that the connection was breaking up to avoid answering any more questions. "The signal is bad here. I can't hear you clearly." He hung up the phone abruptly, and I watched him walk back to the center of the room to whisper something in Gretchen's ear that made them both burst into laughter. They high-fived each other as if they had just pulled off the greatest prank of the century, completely unaware that their victim was witnessing every second of it. The sadness I had felt earlier evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that settled in the pit of my stomach like a stone. I raised my phone again, but this time I switched to the camera mode and began recording everything I saw through the clear glass of the window. I zoomed in on Arthur dancing with a glass of wine, capturing the timestamp and the clear evidence of his robust health. I recorded Gretchen flaunting her stolen wealth and Derek drinking the vintage wine that I had been saving for a special occasion. Every second of footage was a nail in the coffin of their free ride, providing me with the indisputable proof I would need for the legal proceedings that were about to follow. I recorded for 10 solid minutes to ensure there could be no denial of what was happening inside that house tonight. When I finally lowered the phone, I took one last look at the family that I had sacrificed my entire adult life to support and protect. They looked so happy without me, so unburdened by the weight of the responsibilities they had dumped on my shoulders for a decade. I leaned closer to the cold glass, my breath fogging it up slightly for a brief second, and whispered the words that would mark the end of my life as their doormat. Enjoy your last meal because tomorrow you will digest the consequences. I turned away from the glowing windows and walked back to my car through the darkness without looking back a single time. There was no need to storm in there and cause a scene that would only give them the satisfaction of calling me hysterical or dramatic. I drove away from the property in silence, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, sounding like the crumbling of my past life. I navigated the car toward the city center and pulled into the parking lot of the most expensive hotel in town. I walked to the front desk and booked a suite for an entire week, using the credit card that I was about to cancel for everyone else. Tonight, I would sleep in a bed with high thread count sheets and prepare for the war that I was going to unleash first thing in the morning. The next morning, while my family was likely sleeping off their hangovers, I was sitting in my lawyer's office. Mr. Sterling, a distinguished man with silver hair who had managed my business contracts for years, sat across from me with a look of grave concern etched onto his face as he reviewed the evidence I had collected the night before. I had printed out the screenshots of the text messages, the time-stamped photos of the party, and a detailed spreadsheet of every unauthorized transaction Gretchen had made in the last 6 months. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the scratching of his fountain pen as he made notes on the legal pad in front of him. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the irreversible step I was about to take, knowing that this action would sever the final legal ties that allowed my father to control my life. I looked Mr. Sterling in the eye and delivered the instructions that I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times during the drive over. I want to revoke the power of attorney immediately and draft an eviction notice for my property. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, seemingly understanding that I had finally reached my breaking point and promised to have the papers filed with the court by noon that same day. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in years and drove straight to the main branch of my bank to handle the financial aspect of my revenge. I sat down with the branch manager and systematically went through the process of canceling every single supplementary credit card that had been issued to Arthur and Gretchen. Watching the teller cut the plastic cards in half gave me a sense of satisfaction that was almost euphoric. I then requested to close the joint checking account that I shared with my father, the one I deposited money into monthly for household expenses, which he mostly used for gambling and liquor. I withdrew every single cent of the remaining balance, leaving the account with a zero balance that would shock him the next time he tried to make a withdrawal. My next task was perhaps the most personal one, as it involved the very thing Arthur used to hold me hostage: his health. I dialed the number for the specialty pharmacy that handled his prescriptions, specifically the expensive imported supplements and brand-name heart medications he insisted on having. The pharmacist answered quickly, and I could hear the familiar hum of the busy shop in the background as I gave him my instructions. When I told him to remove my credit card from the file and stop the automatic refills for the premium packages, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Joanna, are you sure the system says the payment for Arthur's heart medication has been declined?" I thought about the man I saw dancing the night before, the man who had enough energy to party, but claimed he was too sick to work. "I am sure. Cancel the premium order. He can use the standard insurance plan. I hung up the phone with a sense of finality, knowing that standard insurance would only cover the generic versions of his pills, which worked perfectly fine but lacked the prestige he felt entitled to. I spent the rest of the afternoon working remotely from my hotel suite, preparing my business for any potential fallout and ensuring my personal assets were completely untouchable. That evening, the silence of my hotel room was interrupted by the sudden and aggressive vibration of my cell phone on the marble table. The screen lit up with Arthur's name, and then a moment later, it lit up again and again, indicating a rising panic on his end. I knew exactly what was happening. He had likely gone to the pharmacy to pick up his usual haul of premium vitamins and was currently standing at the counter facing a declined transaction. He was probably yelling at the poor pharmacist right now, trying to bully them into giving him what he wanted, but this time, there was no credit card on file to save him. I watched the phone buzz and dance across the table, vibrating with the rage of a man who had just realized his golden goose had stopped laying eggs. I did not feel the urge to answer, nor did I feel the familiar pang of guilt that used to manipulate me into submission. Instead, I calmly picked up the device and navigated to the settings menu to activate the Do Not Disturb mode for all contacts related to my family. I had already recorded a new voicemail greeting earlier that afternoon, specifically for this moment. Anyone who called would hear a cheerful professional voice stating that I was currently busy handling important business restructuring and would not be available for personal calls. I set the phone back down, poured myself a glass of wine, and watched the city lights flicker outside, knowing that the real storm for my family was just beginning. 2 days later, chaos erupted at the front door of the house I had paid for. I had arranged for a private security team to accompany the local law enforcement officers because I anticipated that my family would not leave the premises without putting up a significant fight. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the neighborhood as the convoy of vehicles pulled up to the curb, shattering the peaceful silence with the heavy thud of car doors closing in unison. I watched the entire operation unfold in real time through the live video feed from the security cameras I had installed months ago, sitting safely in my hotel room with a cup of coffee in my hand. The officers pounded on the solid oak door with enough force to rattle the windows, demanding entry into the property to execute the emergency court order I had obtained. It took several minutes of persistent knocking before the door finally swung open to reveal Gretchen standing there in a disheveled silk robe that I had purchased for her last Christmas. She looked confused and still half asleep with her makeup smeared across her face from the night before, but her confusion quickly turned to indignation when she saw the uniformed officers standing on the porch. She attempted to slam the door in their faces while screaming about harassment, but the lead officer blocked it firmly with his hand and stepped into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. My father, Arthur, came stumbling down the grand staircase a moment later, wearing his pajamas and shouting demands to know why armed men were invading what he still deluded himself into thinking was his home. The lead officer wasted no time in presenting the paperwork that authorized the immediate removal of all unauthorized occupants from the residence. "Mr. Arthur, this is a legal eviction notice. You are trespassing on private property." Arthur stared at the document with his mouth agape, his face turning a shade of purple that usually preceded one of his infamous tantrums whenever he was denied something he wanted. He tried to argue that there must be some mistake and claimed that his daughter would never do this to him, but the officer remained impassive and informed him that they had 30 minutes to gather their essential personal belongings and vacate the premises. Realizing that his authority as the patriarch held absolutely no weight with the law, Arthur resorted to the only weapon he had left in his arsenal. He suddenly clutched his chest with both hands and let out a strangled cry before collapsing onto the hardwood floor with a theatrical flair that would have earned him an award in a soap opera. Gretchen immediately started screaming that the police were murdering her father and demanded that someone call an ambulance right away. "My heart. You are killing me. I am having a heart attack right now." He writhed on the floor, gasping for air and making loud groaning noises that were intended to evoke guilt and hesitation from the officers. However, I had prepared for this exact scenario by requesting that a paramedic team be present on standby during the eviction process. Two medical professionals stepped forward instantly with their equipment and began checking his vitals while he continued his dramatic performance. The room fell silent except for Arthur's exaggerated moans as the paramedic wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm and checked his pulse against his watch. After less than 60 seconds of assessment, the paramedic removed the stethoscope from his ears and looked down at my father with a completely unimpressed expression. "Sir, your vitals are completely stable. Please stand up and cooperate with the officers." The humiliation that washed over Arthur's face was captured perfectly in high definition by the security camera, as he realized his favorite manipulation tactic had been exposed as a fraud in front of strangers. The police officers lost whatever patience they had remaining and physically hoisted him to his feet, ordering him to start packing immediately or face arrest for obstruction of justice. For the next 20 minutes, Gretchen and Arthur ran around the house frantically throwing clothes into garbage bags because they did not even have suitcases prepared. They tried to take the expensive silverware and the flat-screen television from the living room, but the security team intervened and informed them that those items belonged to the property owner. They were eventually escorted out the front door carrying nothing but a few plastic bags filled with clothes and toiletries, looking like utter defeats. The commotion had attracted the attention of the entire neighborhood, and I watched as the neighbors stood on their lawns in their bathrobes, whispering and pointing at the spectacle. Gretchen tried to hide her face behind her hair to avoid the gazes of the people she had previously bragged to about her wealthy lifestyle, while Arthur walked with his head hung low in shame. As soon as they stepped onto the public sidewalk, the locksmith who had been waiting in his van approached the door with his drill in hand. The heavy front door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the street, and the sound of the drill destroying the old lock signaled the end of their reign over my life. That evening, the silence of my hotel room was shattered by a pounding on the door that sounded more like an assault than a request for entry. I approached the peephole cautiously and saw Gretchen standing in the hallway, her face twisted in rage and her eyes swollen from crying. I realized instantly that I had made a critical error by not disabling the GPS tracker on the old sedan I had allowed her to drive for years, which led her straight to my location. I opened the door but kept the security chain engaged, creating a small gap that was just wide enough for her venomous words to spill through. She tried to force her way in, slamming her shoulder against the heavy wood, but the chain held firm against her desperate assault. "You selfish witch! How could you throw your own father out on the street?" She screamed the accusation loud enough for the entire floor to hear, attracting the attention of guests in neighboring rooms who peeked out into the hallway. I looked at my sister, a woman nearing 40 who was throwing a tantrum like a toddler because her free ride had finally come to an abrupt end. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to defend my actions or justify the years of financial abuse I had endured. Instead, I calmly picked up the room phone and dialed the front desk to request immediate security assistance for a disturbance on my floor. 2 large security guards arrived within minutes and physically escorted a screaming Gretchen towards the elevators while I closed the door and locked it without saying a single word to her. My heart was still racing from the confrontation when my phone rang again, displaying a number I hadn't seen in over a decade but knew by heart. It was my mother Linda, the woman I had spent years resenting for abandoning us when I needed her the most. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the decline button, but something in my gut told me to answer. Her voice on the other end was trembling not with anger, but with a profound sadness that disarmed my defenses immediately. She told me she had read about the eviction online because the neighbors had posted videos of the police raid on community forums. I braced myself for a lecture on filial piety, but instead she began to weep and poured out a truth that shattered my entire understanding of my past. Joanna, listen to me. He forced me to leave. He threatened to ruin your future if I didn't disappear. She explained through her sobs that Arthur had discovered a small inheritance she had received from her grandmother and demanded she hand it over to cover his gambling debts. When she refused in order to save the money for my college tuition, he gave her an ultimatum: leave the money and the family, or he would sabotage my chances of getting into university by ruining my credit and reputation before I even turned 18. She had chosen to sacrifice her place in my life to ensure I had the financial freedom to build a future, a sacrifice I had mistaken for abandonment for 10 years. I collapsed onto the hotel bed as the weight of her confession hit me, realizing that the villain of my story had actually been my silent protector all along. We cried together on the phone for an hour, bridging the chasm of silence that Arthur's lies had created between us. Just as I was beginning to process this emotional revelation, my phone pinged with a notification from my best friend, Jessica. She had sent me a link to a Facebook post with a frantic message urging me to open it immediately before it went viral. I clicked the link and saw a lengthy post on Gretchen's profile that included a photo of Arthur sitting on a curb looking pathetic and staged. The caption was a masterpiece of fiction describing me as a heartless monster who had become wealthy and then discarded her ailing father and devoted sister in the middle of winter to die of exposure. The comment section was already filling up with strangers calling for my business to be boycotted and wishing terrible karma upon me. Look at this post, Joanna. Gretchen is spinning a story that you are abusing a sick old man. Jessica's voice message played in the background as I scrolled through the lies Gretchen had woven to garner sympathy and donations from gullible people. She claimed Arthur had been denied his life-saving heart medication by my cruelty, conveniently omitting the fact that he was perfectly healthy. The sadness I felt from my conversation with my mother evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp fury that was far more dangerous than my earlier grief. They weren't just content with stealing my money. Now they were trying to destroy the reputation I had built from scratch. I realized then that simple silence and eviction were not enough to stop people like them. I wiped my tears, took a screenshot of the defamatory post, and opened my laptop. If they wanted a public war, I would give them one, but I would bring the one weapon they didn't have: the truth. The following morning, I decided to break my silence and let the world see the ugly truth. I sat at the desk in my hotel suite with a cup of black coffee and opened the social media platform where Gretchen had posted her fabrications the night before. Her post had gained significant traction overnight, with thousands of shares from sympathetic strangers who believed her sob story about a wealthy daughter abandoning her sick father. I took a deep breath and began composing my response, not with emotional pleas or angry ranting, but with the cold and indisputable language of receipts and timestamps. I uploaded a series of images that I had meticulously organized into a digital folder titled The Reality, which served as a direct counter-narrative to her lies. The first image was the invoice for the $25,000 birthday party that I had paid for in full, complete, with my signature at the bottom and the date of the event. I highlighted the line items for premium champagne and imported caviar to show the world exactly what kind of suffering my father was enduring. Next came the credit card statements from the supplementary card Gretchen had been using for years, detailing thousands of dollars spent on designer handbags and spa treatments while she claimed to be destitute. But the final piece of evidence was the video I had recorded through the living room window on the night I was supposedly leaving them to freeze. I uploaded the clip alongside a screenshot of Arthur's text message claiming he sent the wrong address because of the snow. The timestamp on the video matched the timestamp of his text perfectly, showing him dancing vigorously with a glass of scotch in his hand at the exact moment he claimed to be confused and lost. I hit the post button and watched as the digital tide turned almost instantaneously against the family that had tried to destroy me. The internet detectives who had previously attacked me began to dissect the evidence I provided and quickly realized they had been played by a group of manipulators. The comments section on Gretchen's original post flooded with angry messages calling her a liar and a grifter who exploited the kindness of strangers. People pointed out Arthur's energetic dancing in the video and mocked his claims of having a heart condition that required expensive medication. Within an hour, my phone began to ring with the specific ringtone I had assigned to my father, indicating that he had seen the destruction of his reputation in real time. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone, recording the conversation, as yet another layer of insurance against their deceit. "Take it down, Joanna. People are calling me a fraud. Take it down now." His voice was shrill with panic and lacked the commanding tone he used to use when he demanded money from me. He wasn't apologizing for lying or for leaving me in the snow. He was only terrified because his mask had finally slipped in front of an audience he couldn't control. I leaned back in my chair and watched the notifications on my laptop screen continue to multiply as more people shared my side of the story. "I am just telling the truth, Dad. Isn't that what you taught me?" "Oh, wait. You taught me how to lie." I hung up the phone before he could scream another excuse and immediately blocked his number to prevent any further harassment. A few minutes later, another call came through from a number I recognized as belonging to my brother-in-law, Derek. I debated ignoring it, but decided that hearing the consequences of his complicity would bring me a sense of closure. I answered the phone to hear Derek sounding hyperventilating and completely stripped of the arrogant confidence he had displayed at the party. "My boss saw the video. I just got fired because of your family drama." It turned out that Derek's employer did not appreciate seeing their sales representative drinking stolen wine and partying while lying to his sister-in-law on a viral video. The internet had identified him within minutes of my post going live and had flooded his company's social media pages with complaints about his character. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction, knowing that the man who had mocked me while I froze was now facing the unemployment line. I didn't offer him any sympathy or words of comfort because he had chosen his side when he decided to lie for his wife and father-in-law. I hung up on him as well and proceeded to block every single number associated with my former family, including Gretchen and her friends. I then forwarded all the evidence of their harassment and the public backlash to Mr. Sterling, with instructions to send a final cease and desist letter. The letter would inform them that any further mention of my name or attempts to contact me would result in an immediate defamation lawsuit that they could not afford to fight. I closed my laptop and walked over to the window to look out at the city below, feeling a heavy weight finally lift off my shoulders. The truth was out there now, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to hide in the shadows of their lies. 6 months later, the seasons changed from a bitter winter to a vibrant, hopeful spring that mirrored the transformation in my own life. The snow that had once trapped me on that desolate mountain had long since melted away to reveal a fresh landscape full of possibilities and new beginnings. I often found myself thinking about how much had changed since that fateful night when I stood shivering in the cold while my family partied without me. The mighty empire of manipulation that Arthur had built upon my financial generosity had completely crumbled into dust, leaving him with absolutely nothing but his regrets. He was currently residing in a state-run nursing home because he had no assets left to fund the luxurious lifestyle he felt entitled to. The facility was stark and understaffed, which meant there was no one there to cater to his every whim or listen to his exaggerated complaints about his health. He spent his days in a small shared room with peeling paint on the walls, eating the same bland cafeteria food that he used to mock when I suggested we budget our expenses. Gretchen had also faced a brutal collision with reality that had stripped away her arrogance and left her looking a decade older than her actual age. She was no longer the pampered princess who spent her days shopping for handbags using my credit cards or lounging at expensive spas. She was now working double shifts as a waitress at a fast food diner on the edge of town, where she had to serve rude customers who treated her with the same disdain she once showed me. I drove past the restaurant once and saw her wiping down greasy tables with a look of utter misery etched onto her tired face. It was a harsh punishment for a woman who had never worked a day in her life, but it was the only way she could pay off the mountain of debt she had accumulated. I had taken decisive steps to scrub their influence from my life completely by selling the Victorian mansion that had been the stage for so much of their deception. I used the proceeds from the sale to purchase a beautiful but modest cottage just a few miles away from where my mother Linda was living. Being close to her allowed us to rebuild the bond that Arthur had stolen from us, and we spent our weekends gardening or cooking dinner together in a peaceful silence that I had craved for years. My career as a real estate developer had flourished during this period because I was finally able to invest my energy and resources into my business instead of pouring them into a black hole of family greed. One afternoon, while I was working in my home office, I received a letter in the mail with handwriting that I recognized instantly despite its shakiness. It was from Arthur, and the return address on the envelope confirmed that it had been sent from his nursing home facility. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of curiosity about what he might have to say, or what new excuse he might have concocted to justify his betrayal. I held the envelope over the fireplace in my living room and watched the flames dance mesmerizingly below my hand. I realized that reading his words would only invite his toxicity back into my head and grant him a voice in my life that he no longer deserved. I tossed the unopened envelope directly into the roaring flames and watched with a sense of profound relief as the paper curled and turned to ash. I did not need his apology to move forward because I had already found the peace that I had been searching for within myself. And here's what I want to share with you after this story. The most important lesson I learned from this harrowing experience is that sharing DNA with someone does not give them the right to abuse or exploit you. We are often taught that family comes first and that we must sacrifice everything for our blood relatives, but that loyalty must go both ways to be healthy. If your family members consistently disrespect your boundaries and treat you like a resource rather than a person, you have every right to cut them off to save yourself. Another crucial takeaway is that financial independence is the strongest shield a woman can have against manipulation and control.